The late August heat pressed down on Austin like a heavy blanket, the kind of oppressive Texas summer that made even the hardiest folks seek shelter in air-conditioned refuges. Governor Greg Abbott sat in his office on the second floor of the state capitol, the marble walls offering little respite from the sweltering temperature outside. Through his window, he could see protesters gathering on the south lawn, their colorful signs creating a patchwork of dissent. Against the backdrop of manicured government grounds, "Governor, we need to talk about this situation," said Maria Gonzalez, his chief of staff, as she wheeled herself into the office. Her voice carried that particular urgency that Abbott had learned to recognize over his years in politics, the kind that meant trouble was brewing and decisions needed to be made quickly. Abbott turned his wheelchair away from the window, his weathered hands gripping the armrests with the practiced strength of someone who'd spent decades navigating both political and physical challenges. At 65, his face bore the lines of a man who'd weathered many storms, both literal and figurative. The gray at his temples had spread over the years, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. "How many are out there now?" he asked, his voice carrying that distinctive Texas drawl that had become his trademark. In political circles across the nation, about 200 and growing by the hour. The Texas Secular Alliance called for this demonstration 3 days ago, right after you signed the Religious Heritage Protection Act. Social media's been buzzing non-stop. Maria pulled out her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be an endless stream of posts and comments. "They're calling it government overreach, saying you're imposing Christian values on non-believers." Abbott rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The Religious Heritage Protection Act had been a cornerstone of his legislative agenda this session, a bill designed to protect religious displays on public property and ensure that faith-based organizations couldn't be discriminated against in government contracts. To him and his supporters, it was about preserving Texas's Christian heritage and protecting religious liberty. To his critics, it was state-sponsored religion. Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below, and leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. "What's the media saying?" Abbott asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Mixed bag." As usual, the Texas Tribune's running a piece about separation of church and state. Fox News is calling you a defender of religious freedom. CNN. She paused, looking up from her tablet. "Well, they're not being particularly kind. They've got that constitutional law professor from UT saying the law's unconstitutional." The governor let out a slow breath. Professor Sarah Chen from the University of Texas Law School had been a thorn in his side for years, consistently challenging his policies in court and in the media. A brilliant legal mind, he had to admit, even if her politics were diametrically opposed to his own. Any word from the Attorney General's office about potential challenges? Ken called this morning, says they're ready for whatever comes. 3 different civil liberties groups have already filed preliminary injunctions. The ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and that new group, the Texas Secular Alliance. Abbott nodded. He'd expected the legal challenges. In his decades of public service, first as a judge, then as Attorney General, and now as governor, he'd learned that every significant piece of legislation would face court scrutiny. The key was being prepared, having solid legal ground to stand on. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. James Mitchell, his communications director, entered with the kind of rushed energy that suggested breaking news. A tall, lean man in his early 40s, James had worked in Texas politics long enough to read the political winds. Like a seasoned meteorologist, "Governor, we've got a problem. Channel 8 just went live from the Capitol grounds. They're interviewing Dr. Amanda Rodriguez from the Texas Secular Alliance, and she's not pulling any punches." Abbott felt his jaw tighten. Dr. Rodriguez was a philosophy professor at Rice University, articulate spokesperson for secular causes who had a talent for sound bites and an ability to frame complex constitutional issues in ways that resonated with everyday Texans. She was also, he knew, a formidable opponent, someone who did her homework and came prepared for battle. What's she saying? James pulled up the live stream on his phone. Dr. Rodriguez's voice filled the room, clear and passionate. Governor Abbott has forgotten that he serves all Texans, not just Christian Texans. This law creates a two-tiered system where religious beliefs get special protection while secular viewpoints are marginalized. It's exactly the kind of government favoritism that the founders warned against. The camera panned to show the growing crowd behind her, people holding signs reading separation of church and state, and secular Texans matter too. Abbott noticed the diversity of the crowd, young and old, various ethnicities. Some in business attire, others in casual clothes. These weren't just angry college students. This was a cross-section of Texas society. She's calling for a town hall, James continued, says if the governor really believes this law serves all Texans, he should be willing to defend it in an open forum. She's challenged you to a public debate. Abbott felt a familiar stirring, the same feeling he'd had as a young attorney, facing his first major case, or as Attorney General preparing to take on the federal government. It was the thrill of intellectual combat, the opportunity to defend principles he believed in passionately. Maria looked concerned. Governor, I'm not sure a public debate is wise. The risks of what? Abbott interrupted, his voice gaining strength. Of defending the Constitution, of standing up for religious liberty. Maria, I've been fighting these battles for 30 years. I didn't become governor to hide behind closed doors when principles are at stake. Through the window, he could see more protesters arriving. But he also noticed something else. Counter-protesters were beginning to gather as well. Supporters with signs reading "Protect Religious Freedom" and "Faith-Built Texas" were staking out their own section of the Capitol grounds. Sir, James said carefully, if you're seriously considering this, we need to start preparing now. Dr. Rodriguez isn't just an activist, she's got a PhD in philosophy, teaches constitutional law, and she's been preparing for this fight for months. She's not going to be easy to debate. Abbott allowed himself a slight smile. James, I've argued before the Supreme Court. I've taken on the Obama administration. I've spent my entire career in the law. A philosophy professor doesn't scare me. But as he looked out at the growing crowd, feeling the weight of the moment, Greg Abbott knew this wouldn't be just another political skirmish. This was about the soul of Texas, about what kind of state they wanted to be. And he was ready for the fight. The next morning dawned clear and hot, typical for late August in Austin. By 7 a.m., the temperature was already climbing toward what promised to be another scorching day. Greg Abbott had been awake since 5:30, a habit ingrained from decades of early morning workouts and physical therapy sessions. His routine had changed over the years since the accident that left him paralyzed, but his discipline hadn't wavered. As he transferred from his bed to his wheelchair in the governor's mansion, Abbott could already hear the distant sound of activity. From the direction of the Capitol, the protesters hadn't left. If anything, their numbers had grown overnight. Social media had amplified Dr. Rodriguez's challenge, and by morning, #TexasDebate was trending across multiple platforms. Cecilia, he called to his wife, who was already dressed and reviewing her schedule for the day on her tablet. After more than for decades of marriage, she could read his moods better than anyone. And this morning she could see the familiar determination in his eyes. You're going to do it, aren't you? She asked, not looking up from her tablet but smiling slightly. The debate. I can tell by that look you get when you've made up your mind about something. Abbott wheeled over to where she sat at their kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. What do you think? Cecilia finally looked up, her expression thoughtful. She'd been by his side through every major decision of his political career, from his first judicial campaign to his runs for attorney general and governor. Her insights had proven invaluable time and again. I think, she said slowly, that Dr. Rodriguez is hoping you'll decline. It makes you look like you're avoiding scrutiny, like you can't defend your own policies. But if I accept, I legitimize her position and give her a platform she wouldn't otherwise have, Abbott finished. I know the risks, cease, But sometimes you have to trust that the truth will prevail when it's given a fair hearing. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Emergency staff meeting at 8:30. Media requests are pouring in. By the time Abbott arrived at the Capitol, the circus was in full swing. News vans lined the streets, reporters were conducting live broadcasts from the grounds, and the competing groups of protesters had established their respective territories. With the precision of opposing armies, the staff meeting was tense. Around the conference table sat his core team: Maria Gonzalez, James Mitchell, legal counsel Robert Hayes, and political director Jennifer Walsh. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but the atmosphere was anything but cool. The requests are coming in from everyone. James began, reading from a list on his tablet. CNN wants an exclusive. Fox News is offering a primetime slot. Local stations are all clamoring for access. But here's the thing, Dr. Rodriguez isn't just talking to anyone. She's being strategic, selective. What do you mean? Abbott asked. She's turned down the cable news shows. Says she wants this to be about Texas issues for Texas people, not national political theater. She's only agreed to local television and NPR. Abbott found himself grudgingly impressed. Rodriguez was playing this smart, positioning herself as the reasonable academic while making him look like he might be the one seeking national attention. If he chose the bigger media platforms, Governor Robert Hayes interjected, his legal background evident in his methodical approach. I need to stress the legal implications here. Anything you say in a public forum could potentially be used in the court challenges we're facing. These groups have excellent attorneys, and they'll be looking for any statement that might undermine our defense of the Religious Heritage Protection Act. Jennifer Walsh, a veteran of Texas Republican politics, leaned forward. But there's also the political calculation. Your approval ratings among evangelical Christians and traditional conservatives are solid, but you're underwater with suburban moderates and independents. A strong performance in a debate could help with those groups, especially if you come across as reasonable and principled rather than dogmatic. Abbott listened to each perspective, weighing the counsel of advisors he trusted. Through the conference room windows, he could see the protesters below, their signs and chants a constant reminder of the stakes involved. What do we know about Dr. Rodriguez's background? He asked. Maria pulled up a file on her laptop. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, 43 years old, born in San Antonio to a Mexican-American family. First-generation college graduate, undergraduate degree from UT, PhD in philosophy from Harvard. Specializing in political philosophy and ethics, she's been at Rice University for 12 years. Tenure-track professor, published extensively on separation of church and state issues, personal life. Married to Dr. Michael Chen, a physician at Houston Methodist. 2 kids, ages 10 and 13. She's not just an academic, she's been involved in community organizing. Serves on the board of several secular advocacy groups, and Governor. Maria paused, looking up from her screen. She grew up Catholic, left the church in college, but she understands religious perspectives from personal experience. That detail caught Abbott's attention. Someone who had grown up in faith but chosen a different path would understand the nuances of religious belief in ways that could make her a more effective advocate for secular positions. What's her media experience? Extensive. She's been on local news dozens of times, written op-eds for major newspapers, done podcast interviews. She's comfortable in front of cameras and good with hostile questioning. This isn't her first rodeo. James looked up from his phone. Governor, I just got word that she's holding a press conference at 2 p.m. today on the university campus. She's going to formally issue the debate challenge and outline her terms. Abbott felt that familiar competitive fire throughout his career, whether as a young attorney, a judge, or an elected office. He'd never backed down from a fight when principles were at stake. The accident that had left him paralyzed could have ended his career, but instead it had taught him that limitations were often just challenges waiting to be overcome. All right, he said, the decision crystallizing in his mind. Set up our own press conference for 4 p.m. We're going to accept her challenge, but on our terms too. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Maria asked the question everyone was thinking, "Governor, are you sure about this?" Once we announce there's no going back, Abbott looked around the table at his team, then out the window at the protesters below. Some were there to criticize his policies, others to support them, but all were engaged in the democratic process. All were exercising their First Amendment rights on the grounds of the Capitol. That belonged to every Texan. "Maria, I became governor to lead, not to hide. If Dr. Rodriguez wants to debate the principles behind religious liberty and the proper role of government, then let's have that debate. Texas deserves to hear both sides, and I'm confident that our position can withstand scrutiny." As his staff began making preparations for the afternoon press conference, Abbott remained at the conference table, looking out at the scene below. The protesters on both sides represented deeply held beliefs about the nature of American society, the role of faith in public life, and the meaning of religious liberty. Dr. Rodriguez had thrown down the gauntlet, challenging not just his policy, but his willingness to defend it in public. As he watched the crowds below, Greg Abbott knew he was about to enter one of the most important debates of his political career. The battle for the soul of Texas was about to begin. The press conference at 2 p.m. was held in the courtyard of Rice University's Political Science Building, where Dr. Amanda Rodriguez had taught for over a decade. The setting was deliberately chosen academic, serious, but accessible to the public. About 50 reporters had gathered, along with several dozen students and faculty members who had heard about the event through social media. Rodriguez approached the podium with the confident stride of someone accustomed to public speaking. She wore a navy blue blazer and white blouse, professional but not overly formal. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her brown eyes carried the intensity of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the issues she was about to address. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear and carrying easily across the courtyard. "I'm here today not as a partisan, but as a Texan who believes in the foundational principle that government should treat all citizens equally, regardless of their religious beliefs or lack thereof." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "Yesterday, Governor Abbott signed the Religious Heritage Protection Act, a law that, despite its name, does not protect all Texans equally. Instead, it creates a system where religious viewpoints receive preferential treatment from government, while secular perspectives are marginalized." A reporter from the Austin American-Statesman raised her hand. "Dr. Rodriguez, critics would say that religious liberty has been under attack, and this law simply levels the playing field. How do you respond to that?" Rodriguez had clearly anticipated this question. "Religious liberty is indeed a fundamental right, one that I support completely. But religious liberty means the right to practice your faith freely, not the right to have government endorse or promote your particular religious views. The First Amendment protects both the free exercise of religion and prohibits government establishment of religion. This law violates the second part of that protection." She gestured toward a folder on the podium. "I've spent considerable time studying this legislation, and I can point to specific provisions that cross constitutional lines. For example, the law allows religious displays on public property while providing no equivalent accommodation for secular viewpoints. It permits faith-based organizations to receive government contracts, even when they discriminate based on religious beliefs. But secular organizations with ethical hiring practices don't receive similar protections." Channel 8's political reporter, Tom Bradley, followed up. "But Dr. Rodriguez, Texas has a long history of religious heritage. Doesn't the state have a right to acknowledge that history?" "Absolutely," Rodriguez replied without hesitation. "Acknowledging historical religious influence is very different from actively promoting current religious practice. Through government policy, we can teach about the role of faith in Texas history in our schools. We can preserve historic religious sites. We can acknowledge that many of our founders were religious people. But we cannot use government power to advance religious doctrine or create systems that favor believers over non-believers." She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "I grew up in San Antonio in a devoutly Catholic family. I understand the importance of faith in people's lives, and I respect those beliefs even as I've chosen a different path. But that's exactly why this matters so much in a diverse society. Government must be a neutral arbiter, not a participant in religious debates. The questions continued for another 15 minutes, with Rodriguez demonstrating the kind of command of constitutional law and policy details that made her a formidable opponent. She had clearly studied not just the Religious Heritage Protection Act, but similar laws in other states, court challenges, and the broader legal framework surrounding church-state issues. Finally, she addressed the main reason for the press conference, which brings me to why I'm here today. Governor Abbott has signed this law with great fanfare, claiming it protects all Texans' rights. If he truly believes that, if he's confident in the constitutionality and fairness of this legislation, then he should be willing to defend it in a public forum. She looked directly into the cameras. I formally challenge Governor Greg Abbott to a public debate on the Religious Heritage Protection Act and the broader question of religious liberty in Texas. I propose we hold this debate in a neutral venue, moderated by respected journalists, with equal time for both sides to present their arguments and respond to questions. The terms I propose are simple: 2 hours, including opening statements, direct debate, and questions from a panel of journalists representing different media outlets. The debate should be broadcast live and made available to all Texans, because this issue affects every citizen of our state. She paused, then added with a slight smile, "I've heard Governor Abbott is an accomplished debater, someone who's argued before the Supreme Court and isn't afraid of intellectual challenges. I hope he'll see this as an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of his convictions rather than hide behind press releases and prepared statements." 2 hours later, Governor Abbott wheeled up to his own podium in the Capitol Press Room. The space was packed with reporters, cameras, and equipment. Unlike the academic setting of Rodriguez's press conference, this venue projected government authority and institutional power. Abbott wore a dark suit and red tie, his appearance projecting the gravitas of his office. As he approached the microphone, the room fell silent except for the mechanical clicking of camera shutters. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority developed over decades in public office, "I've called this press conference to address the challenge issued earlier today by Dr. Rodriguez, and more importantly, to clarify what the Religious Heritage Protection Act actually does and why it was necessary." He looked directly into the cameras, speaking not just to the reporters but to Texans watching at home. "First, let me be clear about something that seems to be getting lost in the rhetoric. This law does not establish a state religion. It does not force anyone to practice any particular faith. It does not give religious organizations the power to discriminate against individuals based on their personal beliefs." Abbott's voice grew stronger as he continued. "What this law does do is protect the right of communities to acknowledge their heritage, the right of faith-based organizations to operate according to their deeply held beliefs, and the right of religious expression to exist in the public square alongside secular viewpoints." A reporter from the Dallas Morning News called out, "Governor, Dr. Rodriguez says the law creates a two-tiered system that favors religious over secular viewpoints. How do you respond?" "I respectfully disagree with Dr. Rodriguez's characterization," Abbott replied. "This law doesn't favor religious viewpoints over secular ones. It simply ensures that religious viewpoints aren't discriminated against, which has been happening with increasing frequency across our nation." He gestured toward a stack of legal briefs on the podium. "As Attorney General, I fought case after case where religious expression was being silenced, where faith-based organizations were being excluded from public programs simply because of their religious character, where historical religious symbols were being removed not because they were offensive, but because they were religious. The Religious Heritage Protection Act levels the playing field by ensuring that religious perspectives have the same access to public forums and public programs as secular perspectives. It's about equality, not preference." Channel 4's political correspondent raised her hand. "Governor, will you accept Dr. Rodriguez's debate challenge?" Abbott smiled the confident smile of someone who had made up his mind and was comfortable with his decision. "I absolutely will accept Dr. Rodriguez's challenge. though I have a few modifications to suggest for the format. The room erupted in questions and camera flashes, but Abbott continued over the noise, however. I believe this debate should reflect the seriousness of the constitutional issues involved. I propose we expand the format to include additional participants, constitutional law scholars, religious liberty experts, and representatives of different faith communities affected by these issues. I also believe the venue should reflect the importance of this debate to all Texans. Instead of a closed academic setting or television studio, I propose we hold this debate in a public forum where ordinary Texans can attend and ask questions directly. He paused for effect. I'm thinking the Austin Convention Center, with seating for several thousand Texans, broadcast live across the state, with a format that allows for citizen questions alongside professional moderation. The reporters were scribbling frantically, recognizing that Abbott had just escalated the stakes considerably. What Rodriguez had proposed as an academic debate, Abbott was transforming into a major public event. Governor called out the political reporter from San Antonio's News 4. Aren't you concerned about the risks of such a large public format? Abbott's expression grew serious. The only risk I'm concerned about is the risk of not having this conversation at all. Texans deserve to hear a full discussion of these issues, not sound bites and social media posts. They deserve to understand what religious liberty means, what the Constitution actually says, and how these principles apply to the challenges we face today. Dr. Rodriguez wanted a debate about the Religious Heritage Protection Act and religious liberty in Texas. I'm prepared to give her exactly that, but let's do it right, with the gravity and public engagement these issues deserve. As Abbott concluded his remarks and began fielding additional questions, both supporters and critics recognized that what had begun as a relatively simple academic challenge had transformed into something much larger. The debate about religious liberty in Texas was about to become a major public event, with implications far beyond the state's borders. The battle lines were drawn, the venue was set, and two formidable opponents were preparing for what promised to be one of the most significant political debates in recent Texas history. The week following the dueling press conferences transformed Austin into a political pressure cooker. The Austin Convention Center had been booked for the following Saturday evening, giving both sides exactly 10 days to prepare for what local media had dubbed the Great Texas Debate. Ticket requests had overwhelmed the system within hours of the announcement, with more than 50,000 people trying to secure seats in a venue that held only 4,000. In the governor's mansion, Abbott had converted his home office into a war room. Law books, constitutional treatises, and policy briefs covered every available surface. His longtime friend and former colleague, retired Justice Nathan Brooks from the Texas Supreme Court, had agreed to help with debate preparation, driving down from Dallas to spend the week in Austin. Greg, Justice Brooks said, settling into a chair across from Abbott's desk. You know, I've got to ask, are you sure about this format? A convention center full of people, live television, citizens asking unscripted questions. It's a hell of a risk. Abbott looked up from the legal brief he'd been annotating. At 68, Nathan Brooks carried himself with the measured dignity of someone who had spent decades making difficult legal decisions. They'd known each other since Abbott's early days as a judge, and Brooks had been a mentor during Abbott's transition from the judiciary to electoral politics. Nathan, you remember what you told me when I was considering running for Attorney General? Abbott asked. Refresh my memory. You said that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. That if you really believe in something, you have to be willing to put yourself on the line to defend it. Brooks smiled slightly. I also told you to pick your battles carefully. This Rodriguez woman isn't some lightweight activist. I've read her academic work. She's sharp, she's prepared, and she's got nothing to lose. You, on the other hand, are the sitting governor with a political future to consider. Through the window, Abbott could see security personnel patrolling the mansion grounds. The increased attention had necessitated additional protective measures, not because of any specific threats, but because the debate had captured national attention in ways that surprised even his experienced political team. Let me ask you something, Abbott said, wheeling around to face his old friend directly. Do you think the Religious Heritage Protection Act is constitutional? Brooks paused, his legal mind clearly working through the complexities. Honestly, parts of it are solid. The provisions protecting religious displays with historical significance. The protections for faith-based organizations hiring practices, those have precedent and should survive court challenges. But some of the broader language about accommodating religious viewpoints in government programs, that's where it gets tricky. Tricky how? The devil's in the implementation. If local governments interpret the law as requiring them to prefer religious perspectives over secular ones, or if they use it to exclude non-religious viewpoints from public forums, then you've got Establishment Clause problems. The law needs to be about equal access, not preferential treatment. Abbott nodded. This was exactly the kind of nuanced discussion he needed to be prepared for. Dr. Rodriguez would undoubtedly focus on the potential for abuse and overreach, while he needed to emphasize the law's protective intent and constitutional foundations. James Mitchell knocked and entered without waiting for a response, a privilege earned through years of managing Abbott's communications under pressure. Governor, we need to talk about format and ground rules. Dr. Rodriguez's team sent over their proposal. He handed Abbott a detailed document outlining everything from podium height to timing of commercial breaks. They're being very thorough. James continued, professional, but clearly they've thought through every angle. Abbott scanned the proposal. What do they want for opening statements? 8 minutes each. Then alternating questions from a 3-person panel of journalists. Then 30 minutes of citizen questions from the audience. Then closing statements. 2.5 hours total with breaks. Who are they proposing for the journalist panel? Sarah Martinez from Channel 8, Tom Bradley from the Austin American-Statesman, and James paused, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from UT's Journalism School. Abbott raised an eyebrow. Not the same Jennifer Walsh who used to work for the Democratic Party? The very same. Rodriguez's team specifically requested her, saying they wanted someone with both journalistic credentials and political experience who could ask tough questions of both sides. Justice Brooks leaned forward. That's actually not a bad choice from their perspective. Walsh has a reputation for fairness, and having a former Democratic operative ask tough questions of Rodriguez could actually help your credibility with moderate viewers. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Maria Gonzalez entered, followed by a woman Abbott didn't immediately recognize, middle-aged, professionally dressed, carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. Governor, Maria said, I'd like you to meet Dr. Rachel Morrison. She's a constitutional law professor at SMU and an expert in First Amendment issues. She's agreed to help with debate preparation. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, extending her hand. Governor Abbott, I've followed your career for years, particularly your work as Attorney General on religious liberty cases. I think this debate presents an important opportunity to clarify some widespread misconceptions about the First Amendment. As they settled around Abbott's conference table, Dr. Morrison opened a thick binder. I've been studying Dr. Rodriguez's academic work and public statements. She's sophisticated in her understanding of constitutional law, but I think there are some vulnerabilities in her position, such as she tends to interpret the Establishment Clause very broadly, in ways that go beyond Supreme Court precedent. She also seems to conflate accommodation of religion with endorsement of religion, which are legally distinct concepts. If you can draw those distinctions clearly, you can put her on the defensive. James looked up from his notes. What about the political side? How does this play with different voter groups? That's the interesting part, Dr. Morrison replied. Polling shows that most Texans support religious liberty in principle, but they get uncomfortable if they think government is favoring one faith over others, or excluding non-religious viewpoints entirely. The key is framing this as equal access, rather than special treatment. Abbott felt the familiar mental clarity that came when preparing for major legal arguments. The case was complex, the stakes were high, but the principles were clear. Religious liberty was a fundamental right, one that required protection in an increasingly secular culture across town. In a conference room at Rice University, Dr. Rodriguez was conducting her own preparation sessions. Her team was smaller, but equally focused, her husband Dr. Michael Chen, constitutional law professor Dr. David Kim from the University of Houston, and veteran civil rights attorney Sarah Beth Williams. The key, Dr. Williams was saying, is not to let him turn this into a debate about whether religion is good or bad. That's not the issue, and it's not a fight you want to have in Texas. Rodriguez nodded, making notes on her legal pad. The issue is government neutrality. The question is whether the state should be in the business of promoting religious viewpoints, or should maintain neutral ground where all citizens are treated equally. Dr. Kim pulled up a presentation on his laptop. I've analyzed Abbott's legal arguments going back to his time as Attorney General. He's very good at framing religious liberty cases in terms of discrimination against believers. He'll argue that secular groups have been given preferential treatment, and that this law simply levels the playing field. How do we counter that? By pointing out specific ways the law goes beyond leveling the playing field and actually creates preferences for religious viewpoints, the provisions about religious displays, the exemptions for faith-based contractors, the language about accommodating religious perspectives in government programs. All of these create situations where religious views get special treatment. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly reviewing legal documents, looked up. Amanda, I think you also need to be prepared for him to make this personal. He's likely to portray you as anti-religion, someone who doesn't understand or respect faith. Your Catholic background is an asset here. You can speak from experience about the importance of faith, while still defending separation of church and state. Rodriguez considered this. Her journey from devout Catholic to secular humanist hadn't been easy or simple. She still had tremendous respect for the faith of her childhood, and maintained close relationships with family members who remained deeply religious, but she had come to believe that faith was most authentic when it was freely chosen, not promoted by government. I think, she said slowly, the key is to emphasize that separation of church and state protects religion as much as it protects non-religion. When government stays neutral, all beliefs can flourish. When government picks sides, it inevitably gets things wrong and ends up harming the very faiths it claims to protect. Sarah Beth Williams nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. This isn't about being anti-religion, it's about protecting everyone's freedom of conscience. By keeping government out of theological debates, it has no business entering. As the week progressed, both camps intensified their preparations. Abbott's team focused on constitutional law, precedent, and the practical benefits of the Religious Heritage Protection Act. Rodriguez's team concentrated on specific examples of how the law could be misused and the broader principle of government neutrality. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not only the debating skills of both participants, but their fundamental philosophies about the role of faith in American public life. By Thursday, 3 days before the scheduled debate, the Austin Convention Center had become the epicenter of a media circus that stretched far beyond Texas. National news networks had sent their top political correspondents. Religious liberty organizations from across the country had mobilized their supporters, and social media engagement had reached levels typically reserved for presidential campaigns. Governor Abbott arrived at his Capitol office to find his staff dealing with what could only be described as controlled chaos. The phone lines were jammed with interview requests. The email servers were struggling under the volume of messages, and the state troopers responsible for his security were coordinating with federal agents concerned about the size and passion of the crowds expected at the debate. Governor, Maria said as he entered the conference room where his senior staff had gathered for their morning briefing, "We need to talk about what happens after Saturday night. Win or lose, this debate is going to have consequences that go far beyond the Religious Heritage Protection Act." Abbott poured himself coffee from the pot that had become a permanent fixture in the room. Over the past week, what kind of consequences? Political, legal, and personal, James replied, looking up from a stack of newspaper clippings. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial this morning calling this the most important church-state debate since the Scopes trial. The New York Times has assigned 3 reporters to cover it. Fox News is doing a special primetime preview show tonight, and the legal challenges Abbott asked. Robert Hayes, his legal counsel, shuffled through a stack of court filings. 5 different lawsuits challenging the Religious Heritage Protection Act, with more expected before the end of the week. The ACLU has brought in their top First Amendment attorney from New York. The Texas Secular Alliance has hired the law firm that successfully challenged similar laws in Alabama and Mississippi. Abbott felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not anxiety, but the heightened awareness that came before major battles. Are we ready for the legal fights? We're as ready as we can be, Hayes replied. But Governor, I have to tell you some of the provisions in this law are going to be difficult to defend if they're implemented in ways that appear to favor religion over non-religion. The debate on Saturday night could provide opposing counsel with ammunition they'll use in court. Jennifer Walsh, his political director, leaned forward. There's also the electoral consideration. Your approval ratings have actually gone up since this controversy started. You're at 58% among all voters, 87% among Republicans. But if the debate goes badly, those numbers could shift quickly, and there's already speculation about whether this helps or hurts a potential national campaign. Abbott paused. The suggestion of a national campaign, whether as a vice presidential candidate or in his own presidential run, had been floating around political circles for months. Some saw his principled stance on religious liberty as exactly the kind of issue that could energize conservative voters across the country. Others worried that it might typecast him as too regional, too specifically Texan. For national politics, I'm not making decisions based on political calculations, Abbott said firmly. This is about doing what's right for Texas and defending constitutional principles. If that helps politically, fine. If it doesn't, we'll deal with the consequences. Maria nodded, but her expression remained concerned. Governor, there's something else we need to discuss. We've been getting reports that some of the more enthusiastic supporters are planning demonstrations for Saturday night. Nothing violent or illegal, but potentially disruptive. Counter-protesters are organizing as well. What kind of demonstrations? Prayer vigils, mostly. Some groups want to hold religious services in the parking lot before the debate. Others are planning to surround the convention center with displays of religious symbols. The secular groups are organizing their own events, a reason rally. In a nearby park, a display about the separation of church and state. Abbott rubbed his temples. The last thing he wanted was for the debate itself to be overshadowed by circus-like activities. Outside the venue, what are the security recommendations? Increased perimeter, metal detectors at all entrances, and a buffer zone around the building where demonstrations won't be permitted, Maria replied. The Austin Police Department is coordinating with DPS and the FBI. They're treating this like a major political event with potential for civil disturbance. Through his office windows, Abbott could see that the protesters, who had maintained a presence at the Capitol all week, had grown in number and organization. What had started as a few dozen people with homemade signs had evolved into organized encampments, with professional banners, scheduled speakers, and media liaison coordinators. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His secretary entered with a concerned expression. Governor, there's a call I think you need to take. It's Bishop Martinez from San Antonio. Abbott picked up the phone, recognizing the voice of Archbishop Luis Martinez, one of the most influential Catholic leaders in Texas and someone whose judgment Abbott had long respected. Governor, the Archbishop's voice carried both warmth and concern. I've been following the developments around this debate, and I wanted to share some thoughts with you. I'd welcome your perspective, Your Excellence. I want you to know that many of us in the faith community appreciate your efforts to protect religious liberty. The challenges facing believers in the public square are real, and your leadership has been important. But I'm concerned about the tone this debate might take. Abbott waited for the Archbishop to continue. If this becomes a debate about whether religious people deserve special treatment from government rather than equal treatment, it could actually harm the cause of religious liberty. The Church has always taught that faith is most authentic when it's freely chosen, not when it's promoted by political authorities. The Archbishop's words echoed something Abbott had been thinking about throughout his preparation. What would you recommend, Your Excellence? Focus on fairness, not favoritism. Emphasize that you want religious voices to have a seat at the table, not to control the conversation. And remember that many people of faith are also uncomfortable with government that appears to favor religion over other viewpoints. We want protection, not preferential treatment. After ending the call, Abbott sat quietly for several minutes, considering the Archbishop's advice. The Religious Heritage Protection Act had been conceived as a defensive measure, protecting religious expression from discrimination. But he was beginning to understand that his opponents saw it as offensive, as government actively promoting religious perspectives across town. Dr. Rodriguez was having her own final preparations, but the tone in her conference room was markedly different, where Abbott's team was managing a complex political operation with multiple constituencies. Rodriguez's smaller group was focused intensely on the intellectual and legal arguments they would present. "I've been thinking about the opening statement," she said to her assembled advisors. "I want to begin with something personal, something that establishes my respect for religious faith while explaining why I believe separation of church and state actually protects religion." Dr. Kim nodded approvingly. "That's smart. You need to inoculate yourself against the charge that you're anti-religion early in the debate." Sarah Beth Williams looked up from the legal briefs she'd been reviewing. "I think you should also be prepared for Abbott to cite specific examples of religious discrimination cases where religious groups were excluded from public programs or religious symbols were removed from public spaces. He's going to argue that this law simply corrects those imbalances. How do I respond to that? By distinguishing between discrimination against religion and the removal of government endorsement of religion. Religious groups should absolutely be able to participate in public programs on equal terms with secular groups, but government shouldn't be in the business of promoting religious messages or creating systems that favor religious perspectives." Dr. Rodriguez's husband, Michael, who had been quietly observing the preparation sessions, finally spoke up. "Amanda, I think you need to be ready for this to get personal. Abbott's going to try to portray you as someone who doesn't understand or appreciate the role of faith in people's lives. You need to be able to speak authentically about your own journey while still defending your position." She nodded, thinking about her own complex relationship with religion. Growing up in a devoutly Catholic family in San Antonio, faith had been central to her identity for the first 20 years of her life. The decision to leave the church hadn't been easy or sudden. It had been the result of years of study, reflection, and internal struggle. "I think," she said slowly, "the key is to explain that my position comes from respect for faith, not hostility to it. I believe religion is too important to be manipulated by politicians or used as a tool for political advantage. When government gets involved in promoting religious viewpoints, it inevitably cheapens and corrupts the very faith it claims to support." As Thursday evening approached, both camps were as prepared as they could be for what promised to be one of the most watched political debates in recent Texas history. The fundamental question, how to balance religious liberty with government neutrality in a diverse democratic society, was about to be tested in the most public forum imaginable. The stakes had never been higher, and both participants knew that. Saturday night would define not only their own careers, but the ongoing national conversation about faith, freedom, and the proper role of government in American life. Friday morning dawned with the kind of crisp, clear weather that made Austin beautiful in early September. The oppressive heat of August had finally broken, and the temperature was a comfortable 75 degrees with low humidity, perfect weather for the thousands of people expected to gather at the convention center the following evening. Governor Abbott had spent the night at the mansion reviewing his notes one final time, but by 6 a.m. he was ready to shift from preparation to execution. He had learned long ago that over-preparation could be as dangerous as under-preparation, leading to stiff, overly rehearsed performances that failed to connect with audiences. His morning began with his regular workout routine, adapted over the years to accommodate his physical limitations, but no less demanding for that accommodation. The discipline of physical exercise had always helped clear his mind before major challenges, and today was no exception. By 8 a.m., he was at the Capitol for what his staff had designated as the final strategy session. The atmosphere in the conference room was notably different from the previous week. Less frantic energy, more focused determination. His team had done everything they could to prepare. Now it was a matter of execution. Governor Dr. Morrison began, "I want to go over the key constitutional principles one more time, because these are the foundation of your argument." She opened her legal brief to a page marked with multiple colored tabs. First, the Free Exercise Clause protects the right to practice religion freely. Second, the Establishment Clause prohibits government from establishing an official religion. The tension between these two clauses is where most religious liberty debates occur. Abbott nodded. This was familiar territory from his years as Attorney General. The key Supreme Court cases that support your position are Trinity Lutheran v. Cummer, which established that religious organizations can't be excluded from generally available public programs simply because they're religious, and Kennedy v. Bremerton, which protected individual religious expression by public employees. And the cases that support Rodriguez's position, Lemon v. Kurtzman, which created the test for whether government action violates the Establishment Clause, and Lee v. Weissman, which limited government-sponsored religious expression in public settings. But Governor, these cases don't necessarily contradict your position if you frame the Religious Heritage Protection Act as ensuring equal access, rather than preferential treatment. James Mitchell looked up from his phone. "Governor, I just got the final audience composition from the convention center. It's going to be about 60% Texas residents, 40% from out of state. The ticket distribution was supposed to be random, but it looks like both sides organized pretty effectively to get their supporters registered." What's the political breakdown? Hard to tell exactly, but based on the zip codes of ticket holders, it's probably going to be slightly more conservative than the general Texas population, but not overwhelmingly so. There will be plenty of people in that audience who could go either way depending on the arguments they hear. Abbott felt satisfied with that composition. He'd rather speak to a genuinely mixed audience than to a room full of supporters who would cheer everything he said regardless of its merit. Maria entered the room with a stack of newspapers. "The morning coverage is interesting," she said, distributing copies of various publications. The Texas Tribune is calling it the most important political debate in Texas since in Richards and Clayton Williams. The Houston Chronicle has a front-page analysis of what it could mean for your political future. And the Dallas Morning News, she paused, "Well, they're taking bets on whether this helps or hurts you nationally." Abbott glanced at the headlines but didn't linger. He'd learned years ago not to get too caught up in media speculation about his political future. "What matters," he said, "is whether we can have a substantive discussion about important constitutional principles. If we can do that, the politics will take care of itself." Justice Brooks, who had been quietly reviewing legal precedents, looked up. "Greg, I want to give you one piece of advice from someone who spent 30 years listening to legal arguments. The most persuasive advocates are those who acknowledge the legitimate concerns of their opponents while still defending their own position. Meaning, don't dismiss Rodriguez's concerns entirely. Acknowledge that government neutrality in religious matters is important, that protecting minority rights is a legitimate goal, that the Establishment Clause serves an important purpose. Then explain why the Religious Heritage Protection Act actually advances those goals, rather than undermining them." Abbott considered this advice. It was consistent with his own instincts about effective advocacy, but it would require careful balance during the debate itself. At Rice University, Dr. Rodriguez was making her own final preparations in a much quieter setting. Her team had deliberately avoided the media circus surrounding the debate, choosing to focus on the intellectual arguments rather than the political spectacle. She sat in her office, the same space where she had taught constitutional law and political philosophy for over a decade. The walls were lined with books on law, philosophy, and history, the intellectual foundation for the arguments she would make that evening. "I keep coming back to James Madison," she said to Dr. Kim, who was reviewing notes across from her desk. "His memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments is still the best explanation of why government must remain neutral in religious matters." "What's the key quote you want to use?" Rodriguez flipped through a well-worn copy of Madison's writings. Here it is. The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right. That's powerful. But how do you connect it to the current situation? Madison is saying that religion is too important to be subject to government manipulation. When government promotes religious viewpoints, it interferes with the very personal process by which individuals develop their own religious convictions. The Religious Heritage Protection Act, despite its name, actually undermines religious freedom by having government pick winners and losers in religious debates. Sarah Beth Williams entered the office with coffee and what appeared to be a significant legal document. "Amanda, I want you to see this. It's a brief filed yesterday by the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty opposing the Religious Heritage Protection Act." Rodriguez looked surprised. The Baptists are opposing Abbott's law, not all Baptists, but the national organization that focuses on religious liberty issues. They're arguing that the law goes too far, that it could result in government establishment of religion, and that true religious liberty requires government neutrality. This was potentially significant information. If Rodriguez could point to religious organizations that opposed the law, it would counter Abbott's likely argument that he was simply defending faith communities against secular hostility. What's their specific concern? They're worried about the provisions that require government to accommodate religious viewpoints in public programs. They argue that this could lead to government-sponsored religious expression, which violates Baptist principles about the separation of church and state. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "That's perfect. I can use that to show that this isn't about secular hostility to religion, it's about different understandings of what religious liberty actually requires." As Friday afternoon progressed, both participants made their final preparations. Abbott spent time with his family, sharing a quiet dinner with Cecilia and reflecting on the principles that had guided his career in public service. Rodriguez took a long walk around the Rice campus, thinking about the journey that had brought her from devout Catholic childhood to secular academic, and how that personal experience informed her understanding of religious freedom. By evening, both were as ready as they could be for what promised to be not just a debate about Texas law, but a defining moment in the ongoing national conversation about faith, freedom, and the proper role of government in American life. The stage was set, the arguments were prepared, and the entire state of Texas, along with much of the nation, was waiting to see how thoughtful, articulate advocates would defend fundamentally different visions of religious liberty in America. Tomorrow night would test not only their debating skills, but their core beliefs about the relationship between faith and government in a diverse, democratic society. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of electric atmosphere typically reserved for championship sporting events or major political conventions. By 5 p.m., 3 hours before the scheduled start time, crowds had begun gathering outside the Austin Convention Center despite the September heat that still lingered in the early evening air. The scene outside was a study in contrasts that perfectly captured the divisions the debate had exposed. On the north side of the building, supporters of Governor Abbott had organized what they called a religious heritage rally, complete with a small stage where local pastors and community leaders offered prayers and spoke about the importance of faith in Texas history. Signs reading "Protect Our Heritage" and "Faith-Built Texas" created a sea of red, white, and blue. On the south side, Dr. Rodriguez's supporters had gathered for what they termed a constitutional rights vigil. Their signs bore messages like "Separation protects all" and "Equal treatment under law," and speakers included local teachers, university professors, and representatives from various civil liberties organizations. Between these two groups, a heavy police presence maintained a buffer zone that stretched around the entire convention center. Austin Police Department officers, augmented by state troopers and federal agents, monitored the crowds with the practiced efficiency of law enforcement officials who had managed many large political events inside the convention center. The atmosphere was equally charged but more controlled. The main hall had been configured with a large stage at one end, featuring two podiums positioned at angles that would allow both participants to address each other. and the audience simultaneously. Professional lighting created an environment suitable for television broadcast while still maintaining the feel of a public forum. Governor Abbott arrived at 6:30 p.m. through a back entrance, accompanied by his security detail and key staff members. He wore a navy blue suit with a red tie, projecting the authority of his office while remaining approachable. As he was escorted to a holding room backstage, he could hear the murmur of the growing crowd through the walls. "How many people are out there?" he asked James Mitchell, who had been monitoring the audience as they were seated. "About 3,800, which is close to capacity." The demographics looked pretty much like we expected, maybe 60 to 40 conservative to liberal, with a good number of undecideds in the middle. There are delegations from religious organizations, civil liberties groups, and quite a few people who just seem genuinely curious about the issues. Dr. Rodriguez arrived 15 minutes later, also through a separate entrance to avoid any potential conflicts between competing groups of supporters. She wore a dark gray suit with a white blouse, professional and confident without being overly formal. Her small entourage included her husband Michael and her key advisors, but she had deliberately kept her team minimal to avoid the appearance of treating this as a major political event. At 7:45 p.m., the moderators took their positions at a table positioned between the two podiums. The panel consisted of Sarah Martinez from Channel 8, Tom Bradley from the Austin American-Statesman, and Dr. Jennifer Walsh from UT's Journalism School. Each brought different strengths to the moderation. Martinez had extensive experience with live television and political coverage. Bradley was known for his deep knowledge of Texas politics and policy, and Walsh brought academic credentials and a reputation for asking penetrating questions. Sarah Martinez opened the event with remarks that set the tone for what was to follow. "Good evening, and welcome to what we believe is one of the most important policy debates in recent Texas history. Tonight, Governor Greg Abbott and Dr. Amanda Rodriguez will discuss the Religious Heritage Protection Act and the broader questions of religious liberty and government neutrality that it raises." She continued, "The format will include opening statements, directed questions from our panel, questions from audience members, and closing statements. We ask that everyone in the audience respect the process and allow both participants to present their views without interruption." As the two participants took their positions at their respective podiums, the hall fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of television cameras and the quiet rustling of thousands of people settling into their seats. "Governor Abbott," Martinez continued, "you requested the first opening statement. You have 8 minutes." Abbott looked out over the audience, then directly into the cameras that would carry his words to television viewers across Texas and beyond. He had given thousands of speeches over his political career, but few had felt as consequential as this moment. "Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all the Texans who are here tonight and watching at home. I want to begin by making something absolutely clear. This debate is not about whether religion is good or bad, or whether people should be religious or secular. Those are personal decisions that every Texan has the right to make for themselves." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "This debate is about whether government should treat religious perspectives fairly, or whether it should discriminate against them simply because they are religious, and unfortunately, that discrimination has been happening with increasing frequency across our state and our nation." Abbott's voice gained strength as he moved into the heart of his argument. "As Attorney General, I fought case after case where religious organizations were excluded from public programs, not because they were unqualified, but because they were religious. I defended communities where historical religious symbols were being removed not because they were offensive, but because some people objected to any public acknowledgement of our religious heritage. The Religious Heritage Protection Act doesn't give religious perspectives special treatment. It simply ensures they receive equal treatment. It protects the right of communities to acknowledge their heritage. It protects faith-based organizations from being excluded from public programs simply because of their religious character. And it protects religious expression from being silenced in the public square." Abbott looked directly at Dr. Rodriguez, then back to the audience. "Dr. Rodriguez and I disagree about how to balance religious liberty with other important values, But I want to assure her and everyone here tonight that I have tremendous respect for people of all faiths and no faith. My goal is not to impose anyone's religious beliefs on anyone else. My goal is to ensure that religious believers have the same rights as everyone else to participate in public life and contribute to public discourse. The First Amendment protects both the free exercise of religion and prohibits the establishment of an official religion. But some people have interpreted the Establishment Clause so broadly that it effectively nullifies the Free Exercise Clause. They've created a system where government must not only avoid establishing religion, which is correct, but must actively discriminate against religious perspectives, which is unconstitutional. As he approached the end of his opening statement, Abbott's voice took on a more personal tone. I've spent my entire career in public service defending the Constitution and protecting individual rights. The Religious Heritage Protection Act continues that work by ensuring that religious liberty remains a reality, not just a promise. For all Texans, thank you. The applause was substantial but not overwhelming, coming primarily from the sections of the audience where Abbott's supporters were concentrated. As the applause died down, Sarah Martinez turned to Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez, your opening statement, 8 minutes. Rodriguez approached the microphone with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to addressing large audiences. But there was also a sense of gravity in her demeanor that suggested she understood the weight of the moment. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Governor Abbott, for agreeing to this debate. I want to begin by sharing something personal that I hope will help frame this discussion. She looked out over the audience, making eye contact with various sections. Before continuing, I was raised in a devoutly Catholic family in San Antonio. Faith was central to my identity for the first 20 years of my life. I understand from personal experience how important religious belief can be in shaping people's values, providing comfort in difficult times, and creating strong communities. My decision to leave the Catholic Church was not made lightly or quickly. It was the result of years of study, reflection, and prayer. And through that process, I came to understand something that I believe is crucial to tonight's discussion. Religion is too important to be manipulated by politicians or used as a tool for political advantage. Rodriguez's voice grew stronger as she moved into her central argument. Governor Abbott says this is about equal treatment, and I agree that equal treatment is exactly what we should strive for. But the Religious Heritage Protection Act doesn't create equal treatment. It creates preferential treatment for religious viewpoints over secular ones. Let me give you a specific example. Under this law, a city council could display a monument to the 10 Commandments on public property, but they would have no similar obligation to accommodate secular ethical systems or non-religious perspectives. On morality, that's not equal treatment, that's government endorsement of religious viewpoints. The founders understood that government must remain neutral in religious matters, not because they were hostile to religion, but because they understood that government involvement inevitably corrupts and cheapens the very faith it claims to support. When politicians start deciding which religious messages deserve government promotion, they are making theological judgments that they have no authority to make. Rodriguez gestured toward Abbott respectfully. Governor Abbott is absolutely right that religious organizations shouldn't be excluded from public programs simply because they are religious. I completely agree with that principle, but there's a crucial difference between allowing religious organizations to participate on equal terms and creating systems that give religious perspectives preferential treatment. James Madison, the primary author of the First Amendment, wrote that religion must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. When government promotes religious viewpoints, it interferes with that deeply personal process by which individuals develop their own spiritual convictions. As she approached her conclusion, Rodriguez's tone became more urgent. This isn't about hostility to religion, it's about protecting the integrity of both religion and government by maintaining the separation that allows both to flourish. When we blur those lines, we harm both faith and democracy. The Religious Heritage Protection Act, despite its name, actually undermines religious freedom by having government pick winners and losers in religious debates. True religious liberty requires government neutrality, and that's what I'm here to defend tonight. Thank you. The applause for Rodriguez was also substantial, coming primarily from different sections of the audience than had applauded Abbott. As the applause faded, Sarah Martinez prepared to begin the question portion of the debate, knowing that the real test of both participants' positions was about to begin. The opening statements had laid out the fundamental disagreement clearly, Abbott arguing that the law protected religious liberty by ensuring equal treatment, Rodriguez contending that it violated constitutional principles by creating preferential treatment. Now the detailed examination of those competing claims would begin. Tom Bradley from the Austin American-Statesman leaned forward to ask the first question. His journalist's instincts honed by decades of covering Texas politics and policy debates. Governor Abbott, Dr. Rodriguez mentioned the example of 10 Commandments monuments. Under the Religious Heritage Protection Act, could a city display such a monument without also being required to display secular ethical codes or monuments representing non-Christian faiths? Abbott had anticipated this question and was ready, with a response that went to the heart of his legal argument. Tom, that's exactly the kind of hypothetical that shows why this law was necessary. Under current interpretations of the Establishment Clause, many communities have been forced to remove historical religious monuments that have stood for decades, not because they were offensive to anyone, but simply because they were religious. He gestured toward the audience. The Religious Heritage Protection Act allows communities to preserve their historical heritage, including religious heritage, without requiring them to create new monuments representing every possible viewpoint. The key word here is historical. We're talking about preserving existing displays that reflect the actual heritage of Texas communities. But Governor Dr. Rodriguez interjected, that distinction between historical and new doesn't address the constitutional issue. If government displays religious messages, whether historical or not, it's still government endorsement of religion. The age of the monument doesn't change the First Amendment analysis. Abbott turned toward Rodriguez, his response measured but firm. Dr. Rodriguez, I respectfully disagree. The Supreme Court has consistently held that acknowledging our religious heritage is different from establishing a religion. In Van Orden v. Perry, the court specifically upheld the right of Texas to display a 10 Commandments monument on the Capitol grounds, recognizing that such displays can have historical and cultural significance beyond their religious content. But Governor Rodriguez countered, Van Orden was a 5-4 decision, and the court emphasized that the monument in question was part of a larger display that included secular monuments. The court specifically said that context matters. Under your law, communities could display standalone religious monuments without any secular context. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from UT's journalism school raised her hand to ask the next question, recognizing that the exchange between the two participants was getting to the substantive issues that voters needed to understand. Dr. Rodriguez, let me ask you about religious organizations and public programs. Governor Abbott says that faith-based charities and organizations have been excluded from government programs simply because they're religious. Don't they have a right to participate on equal terms? Rodriguez nodded, acknowledging the legitimacy of the concern. Absolutely, Dr. Walsh. Religious organizations should be able to participate in public programs on the same terms as secular organizations. But there's a crucial distinction between equal participation and preferential treatment. Under current law, a faith-based charity can receive government funding to provide social services as long as they don't use that government money to promote religious messages or discriminate based on religion. That's equal treatment there, held to the same standards as secular organizations. But the Religious Heritage Protection Act goes further. It allows faith-based organizations to receive government funding, even when they discriminate in hiring based on religious beliefs. That's not equal treatment, that's special treatment that secular organizations don't receive. Abbott leaned into his microphone. Dr. Rodriguez, you're mischaracterizing what the law does. Faith-based organizations have deeply held beliefs about their mission and their staff, requiring them to hire people who don't share their fundamental beliefs is like requiring the ACLU to hire lawyers who oppose civil liberties. It undermines their ability to fulfill their mission effectively. But Governor Rodriguez responded quickly. There's a difference between private organizations hiring based on their beliefs and organizations that receive taxpayer funding discriminating against taxpayers when government money is involved. Equal treatment principles apply. Sarah Martinez decided to move the discussion to a different aspect of the law. Governor Abbott, the Religious Heritage Protection Act includes language about accommodating religious viewpoints in government programs and public forums. Can you give us a specific example of how that would work? Abbott welcomed the opportunity to explain what he saw as one of the law's most important provisions. Sarah, let me give you a real example from a case I handled as Attorney General. A public university was hosting a conference on ethics and morality, but they excluded religious perspectives from the program, saying that faith-based viewpoints weren't academic enough. That's discrimination, plain and simple. Religious perspectives on ethics and morality have been part of human discourse for thousands of years. Under the Religious Heritage Protection Act, that university would be required to include religious viewpoints alongside secular ones when addressing topics where religion has legitimate insights to offer. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head. But Governor, that example illustrates exactly the problem with this law. Government institutions shouldn't be in the business of deciding which religious viewpoints to include or exclude. Once government starts making those kinds of theological judgments, it's violating the Establishment Clause. How is including religious perspectives alongside secular ones a violation of the Establishment Clause? Abbott asked. We're not establishing a particular religion, we're ensuring that religious viewpoints aren't discriminated against in public discourse. Because, Rodriguez replied, when government decides which religious viewpoints to include, it's making judgments about which forms of religious belief are legitimate or worthy of public consideration. That's exactly the kind of theological decision that government has no authority to make. Tom Bradley leaned forward with a follow-up question. Dr. Rodriguez, are you saying that religious perspectives should never be included in government programs or public forums? Not at all, Tom. I'm saying that government shouldn't be making decisions about which religious viewpoints to promote or include. Religious perspectives can absolutely be part of public discourse, but that should happen through private organizations, religious institutions, and individual citizens, not through government endorsement or promotion. But Dr. Rodriguez, Abbott interjected, what you're describing would effectively exclude religious voices from public life. If government can't accommodate religious viewpoints in public forums, then religious citizens become second-class citizens who can't participate fully in democratic discourse. The exchange was becoming heated but remained respectful, with both participants clearly articulating their fundamental disagreement about the proper role of government in relation to religious expression. Dr. Walsh asked the next question. Governor Abbott, Dr. Rodriguez mentioned that several religious organizations, including the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, have opposed this law. How do you respond to religious groups who say the law goes too far? Abbott paused, considering his response carefully. This was potentially the most challenging question he'd faced, since it undermined his narrative that he was simply defending religious communities against secular hostility. Dr. Walsh, I respect the Baptist Joint Committee and their long history of defending religious liberty, but I think they're misunderstanding what this law does. The Baptist tradition has always emphasized the importance of religious freedom, and this law advances that principle by ensuring that government doesn't discriminate against religious perspectives. I think some religious organizations have become so concerned about avoiding any appearance of government establishment of religion that they've swung too far in the other direction, effectively supporting government hostility to religion. That's not what the founders intended, and it's not what religious liberty requires. Rodriguez saw an opening. Governor, with respect, those religious organizations understand something that's crucial to this debate. True religious liberty requires government neutrality. When government starts promoting religious viewpoints, it inevitably favors some forms of faith over others, and that harms the very religious communities the law claims to protect. The Baptist Joint Committee opposes this law not because they're hostile to religion, but because they understand that government involvement in religious affairs corrupts both government and religion. They're defending authentic religious liberty, not the government-sponsored religious expression that this law promotes. As the formal question period continued, it became clear that both participants were articulate defenders of their positions, but they were operating from fundamentally different premises about the relationship between government and religion. In American society, the audience, which had remained largely quiet during the formal exchanges, was beginning to show signs of engagement, subtle shifts in posture, occasional murmurs of approval or disagreement, and the kind of focused attention that suggested people were genuinely grappling with complex constitutional questions. The real test would come in the next portion of the debate, when ordinary Texans would have the opportunity to ask their own questions and challenge both participants to explain how their competing visions of religious liberty would affect everyday life in their communities. Sarah Martinez looked out over the packed convention center as the formal question period concluded. We now move to questions from the audience. We've selected several citizens to ask questions, and we ask that everyone respect the process and allow each questioner to finish before any response. The first audience member to approach the microphone was Maria Santos, a middle-aged teacher from Austin ISD. She wore professional attire and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing groups, but her voice carried a slight nervousness as she began to speak. My name is Maria Santos, and I teach 4th grade here in Austin. My question is for both of you. I have students from many different religious backgrounds in my classroom: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and some from families that aren't religious at all. How do I explain to these children what this law means for them and their families? Abbott responded first, his voice taking on a warmer tone than during the formal debate portions. Ms. Santos, thank you for the work you do educating our children. What I would tell your students is that this law ensures that all of them, regardless of their family's religious beliefs or lack thereof, have the right to express their heritage and their values in public life. If one of your students comes from a Christian family, they should be able to talk about their faith in school projects or discussions when it's relevant. If another student comes from a Muslim family, they should have the same right. And if a student comes from a family that isn't religious, they should be able to express their values too. This law protects all of those rights equally. Dr. Rodriguez waited for Abbott to finish before offering her perspective. Ms. Santos, I would tell your students that our Constitution protects their right to believe whatever their families teach them about religion, and it also protects their right to be treated equally by their government regardless of what they believe. What concerns me about this law is that it might make some of your students feel like outsiders. If the government starts promoting certain religious viewpoints in public spaces or programs, children from minority faiths or non-religious families might feel like their government considers them less worthy of respect and consideration. The genius of the First Amendment is that it protects everyone equally by keeping government neutral. That way, all of your students, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and non-religious, can know that their government treats them as equal citizens. Maria Santos nodded thoughtfully and returned to her seat, clearly considering both responses. The next questioner was David Kim, a small business owner from Houston who identified himself as a Korean American Presbyterian. Governor Abbott, I support religious liberty, but I'm concerned about how this law might affect relationships between different faith communities. What protections are there for minority religions? Abbott leaned forward, recognizing the importance of addressing concerns from religious minorities. Mr. Kim, that's an excellent question, and it gets to something that's very important to me. This law doesn't favor any particular religion over others. It protects the right of all religious communities, majority and minority alike, to participate fully in public life. As someone from a minority faith community yourself, you understand the importance of ensuring that government doesn't discriminate based on religious belief. That protection applies whether you're part of the religious majority or a religious minority. This law ensures that your Presbyterian church has the same rights as the Baptist church down the street, the Catholic church across town, and the mosque or synagogue in the next community. Dr. Rodriguez asked if she could respond. Mr. Kim, I appreciate your question, because it highlights one of my main concerns about this law. In practice, when government starts accommodating religious viewpoints, it almost always ends up favoring majority religious perspectives over minority ones. Local officials who make decisions about which religious displays to allow or which religious viewpoints to include in public programs are inevitably influenced by the religious composition of their communities. In a predominantly Christian area, Christian perspectives will get preference. In areas with different religious majorities, those perspectives will dominate. True religious liberty protects minority faiths by ensuring that government doesn't pick winners and losers in religious matters. When government stays neutral, all faith communities can flourish without having to compete for government favor. The third questioner was James Patterson, a retired military veteran from San Antonio who identified himself as an atheist. His question was directed specifically at Governor Abbott. Governor, I served my country for 20 years, and I swore an oath to defend the Constitution. I don't understand how a law that promotes religious viewpoints is constitutional when the First Amendment clearly prohibits government establishment of religion. Can you explain that to me? Abbott straightened in his wheelchair, recognizing both the questioner's service and the directness of his challenge. Mr. Patterson, first let me thank you for your service to our country. Your oath to defend the Constitution is exactly what I'm trying to honor with this law. The First Amendment has two religion clauses. It prohibits Congress from making laws respecting an establishment of religion and from prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Some people focus only on the first clause and ignore the second, but both clauses are equally important. This law doesn't establish a religion. It doesn't create an official state church or require anyone to practice any particular faith. What it does do is ensure that the free exercise clause isn't nullified by overly broad interpretations of the Establishment Clause. Mr. Patterson, you have the right to your atheist beliefs, and this law doesn't change that. But other citizens have the right to their religious beliefs, and they shouldn't be forced to hide those beliefs or be excluded from public life because of them. Patterson wasn't satisfied with that response. But Governor, when government promotes religious displays or includes religious viewpoints in public programs, it's sending a message that religious citizens are favored over non-religious ones. How is that not government establishment of religion? Dr. Rodriguez asked if she could address the question. Mr. Patterson, you've identified exactly the constitutional problem with this law. The Establishment Clause isn't just about preventing the creation of an official church. It's about preventing government from sending messages that favor religion over non-religion, or some religions over others. When government displays religious monuments or promotes religious viewpoints in public programs, it's communicating that religious perspectives are somehow more worthy of government support than secular ones. That violates the principle of government neutrality that protects both your rights as an atheist and the rights of religious minorities. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, with citizens asking about specific scenarios. How would the law affect public school curricula? Could government employees be required to accommodate religious requests? What happens when different religious groups disagree about which viewpoints should be included in public programs? Both Abbott and Rodriguez demonstrated command of the legal and policy details, but their fundamental disagreement remained clear. Abbott consistently framed the law as ensuring equal treatment for religious perspectives, while Rodriguez argued that it created preferential treatment that violated constitutional principles. As the citizen question period concluded, Sarah Martinez prepared to give both participants the opportunity for closing statements. The audience had heard detailed arguments about constitutional law, practical implementation questions, and real-world scenarios. Now each participant would have one final chance to make their case to the people of Texas. The energy in the convention center remained high, with audience members clearly engaged by the substantive discussion they had witnessed. Unlike many political debates that focused on personality or partisan talking points, this event had centered on genuine policy differences and constitutional principles. Abbott and Rodriguez had both performed well, demonstrating expertise in constitutional law and policy details while remaining respectful of each other. and responsive to audience questions. But the fundamental question remained unresolved in a diverse democratic society. How should government balance religious liberty with the principle of government neutrality? The closing statements would determine how each participant wanted to leave that question with the voters of Texas and the national audience that had been watching the debate unfold. As Martinez prepared to call for closing statements, both Abbott and Rodriguez knew that the next few minutes would be crucial in shaping public opinion about one of the most important constitutional questions of their time: the proper relationship between faith and government in American democracy. The great debate was approaching its climax, and the resolution would help define the future of religious liberty in Texas and potentially across the nation.